and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to what is the first of our series of public lectures. And indeed, it's my very first public lecture because I'm brand new to the university and I only started in August. My name is Sue Black and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Engagement, with a bit of feedback, for the University of Lancaster. And I'm looking forward very much indeed to tonight's lecture and indeed to the entire series. And I suspect that we have serial offenders here in terms of attending the public lecture series, and that is really very, very welcome. Tonight we are most fortunate to be joined by Dr Veronika Koller, a reader in Discourse Studies in Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University. And her lecture, as you can see, is entitled Talking About Brexit, Voices from Before and After the Referendum. I need to be a little bit explicit here that this is not a lecture about the politics of Brexit. This is an academic lecture on language and linguistics from all sides, and I'd ask you please to respect that. Veronika's main research interests are in business discourse and health communication, and her particular research interest is in metaphor theory and analysis, and she's currently working on the discourse of cancer charities and the discourse around Brexit. So I'd ask you please to give Veronika Koller a very warm welcome, please. Veronika.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's lovely to see so very many of you here tonight, really. So, why are we here? Well, I can't speak for you, obviously, but it's it's exactly 28 weeks until Britain is scheduled to leave the EU. So, Brexit's getting very real. There's another crucial EU summit starting as I speak. The last time I presented on this research, the cabinet was holed up in checkers, so I dread to think what I will precipitate this time. We shall see. So Brexit is getting very real, but it seems that nobody really knows how exactly it will happen. So I think at this moment, perhaps it's time to take a deep breath and to take stock of what led to this moment. And as a linguist, I'm of course particularly interested in the role that language played. Yeah. So how politicians, citizens, the media used language in the run-up to the referendum, but also what we could have been able to observe since. So here's how I've structured my talk. I start with just a brief spotlight on history, because obviously the history of EU-UK relations didn't exactly start in 2016. The main part of my talk will be on the voices of politicians, really, followed by media voices and citizens' voices. So these three groups sometimes seem to be shouting into their own void, but we will be able to see that they actually do relate to each other. Not always directly, but they do. And then I'll provide a summary and a very short outlook. But there's also things that I will not be talking about. One thing that is missing is voices from business. That is mostly because there is hardly any research on it from a language point of view, as far as I know. It's a lot about the possible economic forecast, but from a language point of view, one of my colleagues at Lancaster, Vasiliki Simaki, looks at how financial companies talk about Brexit in their corporate communications, but that's it, as far as I know. What's also I won't talk about tonight is voices from outside the UK, but I want to flag this up, that there is research from how is Brexit perceived, talked about, written about in other countries, in Europe and further afield. Today I've decided to focus on the inner British situation, but it does not stop there. So two publications that I've drawn on. One was issued by the University of Bournemouth very quickly after the referendum, about 2 months. It's a collection of very short pieces by academics about media and communications around the referendum. There's also a book called The Language of Brexit. The first 5 chapters are actually on language as well. So I'll be drawing on that. And the thing I'll be drawing on most, the forthcoming publication, is the one for which you have a flyer on your seats, Discourse of Brexit, which I have been working on for these past 15 months together with 2 colleagues. And yes, it will be published on the 29th of March 2019, and no, that is not a coincidence. The little asterisk here means when you see a reference with that red asterisk, that means it's a chapter from the book. You will there was also, I believe, a list of references of all the work I draw on outside. If you didn't manage to get one when you came in, make sure you get one when you go out. Good, so part one then, Voices from History. So I will throw just two highlights, one on the 60s and 70s and campaigns related to the common market, as it was then known, and another one on the 80s and 90s, talking about Euroscepticism in the British press. Now, if you think that the 2015-16 campaign was too long, too acrimonious, too dire, etc., the good folks in the 60s and 70s had three of them in pretty close succession. Some of you may remember that. So, brief timeline, just to remind you. Britain applied to join the European Economic Community, as it was known then, as early as 1961. And 2 years later, that was turned down by the then French President Charles de Gaulle. Britain tried again in 1967. Again, Charles de Gaulle proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. But then in 1969, he actually resigned. And in 1973, it was third term lucky, from the governments of the day point of view. Other people would have seen that differently. But there, in 1973, Britain did finally join the EEC. And only 2 years later held a referendum on whether that membership should be continued. And interspersed with this, you had the three campaigns, one following the first unsuccessful application, one following, or rather preceding, the accession of membership, and then one an actual referendum campaign, which has been compared to the one of 2016. So media studies have found or have pointed out that pro-Europe campaigners or pro-EEC campaigners had disproportionate access to government resources, media communication channels, because it was very much the governments of the day, three of them, very much were in favor of joining. The three campaigns also employed a range of genres to sway public opinion towards EEC membership, at least the pro-EEC campaigns, obviously, and polls of the time indicate that the pro-EEC campaigns were actually successful. So number of genres, really text types, so speeches were delivered, editorials written, hoardings were put up, leaflets were distributed to households, which may sound familiar. You will remember the 2016 government leaflet, why the government believes that voting to stay in the EU is the best thing for Britain or the UK. Obviously, in the 1970s, the media landscape was wildly different from what we have now. So for starters, it was less concentrated on television formats or face-to-face debates. Research into the history of these campaigns differs on how to assess them, really. So some, like Bloomberg, will say that the media actually, for the 70s campaign, actually educated the public and would claim they did so more than they did in 2016. Whereas other researchers, their assessment would be that the pro-EEC campaigns were basically government propaganda. So as ever, I guess the assessment of these campaigns, both historical and more recent, depends on one's political standpoint. What we can say uncontroversially, though, is that national sovereignty played a big role as a topic in both campaigns, but that it probably found more traction in the 2016 campaign because it was then linked to free movement and immigration. Interestingly, Saunders, for instance, also pointed out that the pro-EEC campaign drew more on the idea of the EEC as a guarantor of peace, given that the lived experience of World War II was very much still in the memory of voters. Interestingly, though, the anti-EEC campaign also used the World War II, but in a metaphorical way. So, for instance, linking resistance to the common market, as it was known, to the French resistance in the Second World War. Right, so forward a little to the 80s and 90s, where, as Hart Mautner, one of the researchers of this era, on this era really, said that we could observe in the British press a move from cautious optimism to aggressive opposition. So the first thing you can see there is actually an anti-EEC campaign poster from the 1970s. Okay, if you can read that, some of the arguments and topics may look quite familiar. This dissent with EEC and EEC membership was most visible in the tabloids. Perhaps, as some have claimed, in proportion to the political integration of the EU as a political union. But there were also economic concerns and cultural and historical resentments, most notably at the time against Germany and France. Various theories have been offered of why the press turned so Eurosceptic and large parts of British politics turned so Eurosceptic so quite early on, actually. One explanation that has been offered is that the EC and later the EU was constructed as something other than Britain, perhaps to forge a British identity in contrast to something after the collapse, basically, of the empire. So to get a new identity that was in contrast to something. It's one explanation, there are others. One form that Euroscepticism or even downright hostility to the EU in the press could take was in the form of propagating so-called Euro myths, in the sense of making claims about usually EU regulations, such as that the EU regulates the shape of bananas, for instance. And there's various others. So many, in fact, and so prevalent are they, that the European Commission has a dedicated website for debunking Euromyths. A very valiant effort, not sure how successful it is, I suppose. The motivation here is, or seems to be really, that to portray in this Eurosceptic discourse, to portray or construct the EU and EU bureaucrats as absurd, ridiculous, humorless, etc., and that the British see through that and unmask that absurdity with humor, with innuendo, as in this immortal headline from The Sun. Researchers have also looked at the political discourse, so what politicians said in the 80s and 90s when they spoke about the EU. And they found that politicians, both Conservative and Labour, very much linguistically separated Britain and the EU, so talked about them as separate entities. And we will come back to that because that's something that we can still observe. Also constructing Brussels authorities as something to contrast Britain and British voters against. But at the same time, and in somewhat contradictory terms, also arguing that Britain should stay within or inside the European community. So much for history. Let's then look at politicians' voices. So what I will be looking at here is the language use in mostly the run-up, sometimes a bit after the referendum, of 3 individual politicians. I will present some work on debates in the House of Commons and then take a closer look at the Leave and Remain campaigns of 2015 and 16. So I would like to start with David Cameron's so-called Bloomberg speech, which he delivered on January 2013. And it has been argued that this speech set the terms for the whole debate about the referendum about the EU, virtually for the whole period running up to the referendum. Ruth Wodak, who spoke here on an earlier occasion, some of you may have seen her talk, has analysed this speech, saying that Cameron here very much followed in the footsteps of other British politicians in history by representing the EU as a separate entity from the UK. Yes? Constructing a British identity that is inherently different to that of continental Europe, but still saying we need to be in Europe, within Europe, inside Europe, etc. I would just like to present an excerpt from this speech and point out just a couple things. So, what does Cameron say here? He says, I know that the United Kingdom is sometimes seen as an argumentative and rather strong-minded member of the family of European nations. And it's true that our geography has shaped our psychology. We have the character of an island nation. Footnote, he here almost echoes Charles de Gaulle when he argued why Britain's membership should be refuted back in 1963. Cameron, we can no more change this British sensibility than we can drain the English Channel. I would argue that what he engages in here is a kind of naturalization, where he gives a natural geographic fact and derives from it something about culture, mentality, and therefore makes it seem as not under the control of humans, nothing we can do about it. It's just natural, really, like the Channel. He goes on to say, and because of this sensibility, we come to the European Union with a frame of mind that is more practical than emotional. There is a gap between the EU and its citizens, which represents a lack of democratic accountability and consent that is felt particularly acutely in Britain. There is a growing frustration that the EU is seen as something that is done to people rather than acting on their behalf. So just to, as you can see, I've highlighted various things here. The first is we. We is here the British people. Okay? So very broad we. But we also have another actor, and that's the European Union. And you can again see that the two are separate. So Britain is here not part of it. It is something separate from it. So he says, we come to the European Union. Now, in order to be able to come to something, you need to be distant from it first. Okay? Right. What you also have is metaphors. So come to the European Union, the gap between the EU and its citizens, but also the family of European nations. So still seeing Britain, again, in somewhat contradictory terms, as separate, but also a member of the family. We then have claims to Britain being different, perhaps even exceptional, and that is done through various comparisons. So he says we come to the European Union with a frame of mind that is more practical than emotional. This implies that other countries' frames of mind might be more emotional than practical. Yeah, so I think this here evokes the notion of a cultural notion of British common sense, really, in contrast perhaps to other European nations, although that is left implicit. Also, on the democratic deficit, as it's known, of the EU, he says that that is a problem EU-wide, but particularly acute for Britain. Yeah, so Britain is here contrasted as different from other EU countries. Good. We cannot talk about Brexit and the referendum without talking about the UKIP and Nigel Farage. I was going to show you a video. I will skip that, just to say that some of you may have seen it, that there was a UKIP video which metaphorically represented the British people as chickens, the EU as a very dark and depressing shed or warehouse where these chickens are cramped in, and the EU as a sort of faceless, sadistic farmer, really. Needless to say, you know, in the end, they go out into the sunshine and live happily ever after because they can leave. What's interesting, I think, is that this video actually draws on another film, Chicken Run, the Aardman animation, where the chickens try to break out from a chicken farm that looks like, you know, some sort of political detention camp, really, and again, from a sadistic farmer, so it plays on that. And Chicken Run itself draws on another film, which is The Great Escape, which is about an prison outbreak. So through this chain, you have finally the idea that the EU is a prison. Okay, Darren Kelsey has looked at articles about Nigel Farage, then leader of UKIP, in the Mail Online. And he found that the Mail Online and also readers and commenters make use of stories and metaphors which present Farage as a missionary who overcomes challenges, obstacles on his journey to Britain leaving the EU, that he makes sacrifices to pursue his goals, etc. In addition, his public image, of course, is very specific, which is constructed by the media, by himself, also by citizens who read, you know, leave comments on media. So he's often depicted, or was often depicted, as smoking, drinking, joking, straight talking, etc. A figure that we might refer to as the laughing, irreverent Briton, you know, who brings the fight to Brussels, as it were. So Kelsey then here says that he has a dual persona in a way. So on the one hand, he's the archetypal hero of the people, who overcomes challenges and is not afraid to, you know, go into battle for the people. But also, given that he presents himself as a representative or spokesperson of the people, but actually comes from a very privileged background, he is also somewhat paradoxical and unpredictable. So he's a bit of a trickster figure at the same time, in archetypal terms. In terms of language, this is now the first bit from the book that I'm presenting. There's evidence that Farage's language use around Brexit, around the referendum, has become radicalized very quickly. Yeah? So this is 2013. And he says, the fact is we just don't belong in the European Union. It's a bit like Cameron's island nation, I suppose, although Cameron still claimed that we should stay inside. Farage says, Britain is different. Our geography puts us apart. Our history puts us apart. Our institutions produced by that history put us apart. We think differently, we behave differently. So again, the claim to Britain being inherently different and incompatible with other European nations. And again, use of a metaphor. Yeah? So the first is literal. Yeah? The geography puts us apart. I mean, there's no arguing with that. There's a channel. But the other ones are then metaphorical. Yeah? And again, he goes from geography to culture to history. A year later, in 2014, we get this. Yet instead of listening to those who elected them, the government takes orders from the European Union and is throwing open our borders to more than 30 million Bulgarians and Romanians who may be coming to settle here. What do we call it, if not yet another sovereignty-sapping power grab from EU elites? So what we have is in this case, the we do have the we, the British people, but we also have those who elected them. So that's the voters, the people. Okay? And the people are here contrasted with three other actors. So first of all, the UK government, who doesn't act in the interest of the people, because the UK government is a rule taker from the European Union, who's also not the British people. And the third other person, if you will, or group, is immigrants from Eastern Europe, from two Eastern European countries. You would note here, though, that here he talks about 30 million immigrants who may be coming here. Yeah, so he leaves the possibility that they might not. But this is what we have in the referendum year from Farage. To those who are happy to welcome immigrants at our doors, I have a suggestion. Go and see the refugee camps in Turkey. See the gangs and the riots. See the young Muslim criminals. See the anger, violence, and riots. It is there and it is ready for export. This kind of evil might not have reached us yet, but it is well in sight. And there is no one in Brussels who can protect us when it comes. So what we have here is clearly an intensification or even radicalization of his language use, if you will. So he again uses metaphor to good effect, to meet his goals. So he talks about doors and inside. Now that makes immigrants seem very, very close. Yeah? If it's not at the borders of a country or across a channel or somewhere else, but at the door. Yeah? And they're inside. So that makes them more tangible. It makes this perceived threat more imminent. Also note that when in 2014 he still said they may be coming, 2016 he said when it comes. There's no doubt anymore. It's presented as a certainty now. Good. Moving to what many would see as a different end of the political spectrum. The language use of Jeremy Corbyn around the referendum and somewhat after it. It's well known that Corbyn has been Eurosceptic in his political history. So he voted leave in the 1975 referendum. He opposed both the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties, and also is on record as a then backbencher for criticizing the EU on many occasions. So let's look at his language a bit. Here's Jeremy Corbyn in 2015. And he says, the EU also knowingly, deliberately maintains a number of tax havens and tax evasion posts around the continent. I think we should be making demands, universal workers' right, environmental protection, etc. So again, what we see here is we versus the EU. Yeah, we are not the same as the EU. We can demand something of the EU that is separate from us. In the referendum year, we see Corbyn making a number of demands on the EU. He says Europe. He here conflates Europe and the EU, which is quite common. He says Europe can and must do far more to meet the needs of our people. The researcher who did this looked at 98 texts by Corbyn, like speeches and articles, and saw that the most commonly used word was labour, unsurprisingly, but the second most commonly used word was actually people, and very often our people. Yeah, so that's quite typical. So he says Europe has to develop, a fairer mechanism. Europe needs to change. And then, finally, after the referendum and commenting on a by-election, he said, both these constituencies have been left behind by globalization and lost out from a rigged economy. And they rejected that by voting leave in the EU referendum, and that's why we voted to trigger Article 50. Okay, so again, the metaphor of left behind and the rigged economy. He doesn't say who the economy was rigged by, but it doesn't need massive background knowledge to fill that in. Away from individual people, I would like to also present another chapter from the book, where the researcher looked at how Remain and Leave Conservatives debated their referendum and EU membership in the Commons, up to from May 2015 until a week before the referendum, really. So it's an interesting study. She worked with a text collection of contributions in the House of Commons of just over 500,000 words. So obviously she didn't go through that by hand, right? So that's a computer-assisted study. And she was interested in what kinds of British national identity Leave and Remain Conservatives construct. So she searched for and she looked at the phrase "we are." Yeah, so examples of the phrase "we are." What she found is to look at Leave-supporting Conservatives first. In a nutshell, they represent the EU as an oppressive force and Britain as different. This is familiar by now, I guess. So, but they also present the EU as having power over the UK and the UK being powerless vis-à-vis the EU. And the grammatical feature they use to do that is passive voice. So they say, nobody would sign up to such a deal, but that is in effect what we are being asked to sign up to in the EU. Even more explicit in the second example here, as we are driven in the EU vehicle towards ever closer union and political union, how does it help to try to fit a couple of emergency brakes that lie within the control of the EU, not us? Yeah? So we have this idea of being driven by whom, as a passenger, and the metaphor of the vehicle that, we, the British, don't have control over, but the EU has. Yeah? So these are familiar themes now of separation, powerlessness, etc. And again, the claim to Britain being inherently different. We in this country are different from our European partners, etc., etc. So that's Leave Conservatives in the House of Commons. Perhaps not too surprising. Here are the Remain Conservatives, who in a nutshell represent EU membership as being problematic and Britain not just different, but exceptional. So, one example is, an obvious example is our obligation as a member state to transpose EU law into particular areas and accept the primacy of the EU, right? So the EU has the power to put Britain under obligation. And then this MP says, so long as we are a member of the EU. Now this so long as, of course, opens up the possibility that at some future date we might not be. This is a Remain supporter. And then something, a formula almost, that we see very, very frequently in Remain supporting language use. This organization is imperfect and can sometimes be frustrating, but we are better off in it. Yeah, so the formula is say something negative about the EU, then but, and then make a claim that Britain should stay. Of course, if you have first said the EU is bad, then you need, why then should we stay in it? Yeah, so that's a very, very common formula. Right, and the idea of British exceptionalism here again from a Remain supporting Conservative. Yes, we are part of a European Union that is reformed and it can achieve greater prosperity, for greater security for Britain. So the idea of the EU working for Britain here, different idea from the EU dictating to Britain. But we are doing it as a proud nation state, etc. Okay, so British exceptionalism here and the focus on British identity. It seems a bit to me, you will draw your own conclusion, but it seems a bit to me that here Remain Conservatives in their language use is a bit almost like a weaker version of their Leave-supporting colleagues, really. So let's finally look at the two campaigns then, Vote Leave and Britain Stronger in Europe. Now, it has been noted that the Remain campaign was unable to build a positive case for Europe, or EU membership more precisely, because that idea had not been established in the past by media and politicians. And I would here refer back to what we saw in the 80s and 90s in the Eurosceptic press. So the groundwork for a positive image of EU membership had really not been laid. Yeah, so there's a disadvantage from the start, really. So if we then compare the two, so in terms of media use, it has been shown that the Vote Leave campaign produced more press releases and faster, and they had pre-planned material, but also material that reacted to the events of the day. Whereas as a tendency, Britain Stronger in Europe produced fewer press releases at greater intervals and used mostly pre-planned material. For Vote Leave, the thematic focus was on immigration, and for the Remain campaign, very much on the economy. It has also been shown that Vote Leave appealed to both positive and negative emotions, so to pride, just as well as frustration and a perceived helplessness and powerlessness. Whereas Britain Stronger in Europe, with its focus on the economy, appealed very much to rationality and to some negative emotion, notably fear. So, of course, both negative and positive emotions can be very strong motivations, but there's good evidence to suggest that emotion itself is stronger than appeals to rationality. So again, that left the Relief campaign with a distinct advantage. Other researchers have looked at the Facebook groups around the two campaigns and what citizens and supporters posted there. So in the Facebook posts for Vote Leave, citizens very much expressed a hope and a desire for freedom. Whereas in the Facebook page for the Remain campaign, citizens repeated the economic arguments and expressed fear. In terms of language, an example from the Vote Leave campaign, the Vote Leave campaign managed to sound more confident. It has been noted, less doubtful. And how they did that is usually with language use as follows. So you would, for instance, find if we vote to leave the EU, we will be able to save 350 million a week. Yeah? So this is the we will. There's no doubt. This is just talking about the future. This will happen. No doubt. Certainty. Yeah? Whereas the Remain campaign would say cheap flights between European destinations could be put at risk. You could say if it's a forecast, it's perhaps, impossible to say, and it's perhaps more advisable to hedge your bets a bit. But the effect of this is that the Vote Leave campaign, who did not do that, but presented things as certainty, came across as more confident. And then we also have the formula I pointed out earlier here by Remain supporting Labour MP Yvette Cooper, who said, Europe's not perfect, but we still get a better deal if we work together. So that's the formula I pointed out before. Also, a lot on the Leave side, a lot of use of the metaphor of Europe as prison, and that carried on until recently, really. That is still very much a productive metaphor. But also, it has been pointed out that the Leave campaign employed language ways of engaging people. So if you look at Vote Leave itself and Take Back Control, that is asking you to do something. Vote Leave, take back control. So the person reading or hearing that is immediately addressed. Whereas this, Britain Stronger in Europe, is basically a statement. Britain is stronger in Europe. That doesn't engage the reader or the listener. Yeah? It gives them a statement that they may or may not agree with. So what's the picture so far then? So the EU is often seen as problematic, including by Remain supporters, or some of them at least, and deficient. It is often presented as acting on its member states, including Britain, which is powerless. So it's disempowering the UK government. And Leave supporters and politicians very much see it as an unreasonable authority that needs to be resisted by the people and the people's heroes. And it's often seen in Leave language use as an oppressive force and indeed a prison, as in that video. Whereas Britain is different, if not exceptional. But then in the language use of Remain politicians, we have this inherent tension that Britain is both part of the EU, inside it, in it, within it, but at the same time separate, which is paradoxical. So that's an inherent contradiction in the language use of Remain supporters. And Leave supporters would also present it as being threatened by immigrants. So in a nutshell, the Remain campaign appealed to rationality and more negative emotions, sounded more uncertain, and somewhat apologetic as well through this formula, EU is bad, but we better stay in. Whereas the Leave campaign appealed to both positive and negative emotions, but managed to sound more confident and, simply by their language use, more engaging. Let's move on to the voices of the media then. I will only have two highlights here. So just two aspects. I will look at the use of the word Brexit on one news website, and then quickly talk about news coverage the morning after the referendum. Two colleagues who have contributed to the book have looked at the development and use of the very word Brexit in the Guardian news website. So they actually looked at every article published on the Guardian website since January 2000 until the end of 2017. That leaves them with 1.3 billion words. And again, obviously, it's a lot of ink being spilled. And obviously, again, this was a computer-assisted study, right? In terms of frequency, unsurprisingly, you can see how the word Brexit skyrockets in 2016. So what you have here, the solid line is the average in months. So obviously it skyrockets. It first occurred, interestingly enough, in August 2012 in the business section. And it continued to be reasonably prominent in the business section. So obviously it was soon taken over by the politics section, also by the blog section of The Guardian, Comment is Free, where readers actually post, but then also still business. Whether that is to do with the business credentials of The Guardian, or perhaps we see here an echo of the Remain campaign's focus on the economy. I leave that for you to decide. But what we can see is that Brexit spreads ever wider through this particular news website. And by the end of 2017, it had actually even occurred in the crossword section a couple times. So I think when that happens, we can say a word has entered the lexicon. Let's look briefly then at how the word Brexit is treated in the business section of The Guardian over the years. This next table is just ever so slightly technical. So what the two colleagues looked at is, if you take the word Brexit, what words occur together with Brexit when you look at the business section of The Guardian compared to the whole Guardian? So what they found is usually it's the word vote. In the business section, Brexit occurs together with vote. And typically in phrases such as after the Brexit vote, following the Brexit vote, the impact, aftermath, or wake of the Brexit vote. So, what happens now, basically. You will see that the second most frequent word is actually uncertainty in the business section. So Brexit comes together with uncertainty in the business section. And if I were to show you more of that table, you would also see that Brexit in the business part of the Guardian website co-occurs with words like fears, worries, concerns. Yeah? So for instance here, before the referendum we have said, the Trade Union Federation has said that Brexit would hit wages, jobs and workers' rights. After the referendum we have seen signs that Brexit has hit investment. So what we have here is we have more evidence for the Remain focus, the Guardian being Remain supporting. We have more evidence for the Remain focus on the economy and also on negative emotions such as uncertainty, fear, worries, etc. So that filters through to particular parts of the media landscape. A colleague and I did a study on editorials and opinion pieces and news reports the morning after the referendum. We looked at the three most popular news websites in the UK, who very conveniently are these three. So where The Guardian is Remain supporting, the Mail Online is Leave supporting, and the BBC aims for a neutral middle ground. So what do we have? So the BBC News, in its opinion piece, discusses mostly divisions within voters as a group. We were particularly interested in metaphors of division here. So you find things like, the referendum has reminded us of a dangerous division in the electorate that lies just beneath the surface. They then go on to describe that as a volcanic gulf, so it's quite interesting what's happening here. The Guardian addresses the divisions between the electorate and the UK political establishment. So, for instance, we find, again, in their opinion piece, door knocking will be important in mending the link between the electors of Britain and the mostly pro-European representatives whom they elect. Okay, so the link is broken. Whereas the Mail sees itself very much as as speaking on behalf of Leave voters, who are often referred to as the only electorate, not always, but sometimes, and are presented as united. So voters in the rich Tory shires and in the Labour heartlands in the north were united in rejecting the threats and blandishments of the party leaders. But in this, the unity among Leave voters, we have a division opening up here between the voters, the Leave voters, and the political establishment. Elsewhere in the Mail, the morning after the referendum, we find opinions expressed that political leaders bombarded voters with scaremongering things, that the voters rise up against the elite, etc. What I find interesting is that this focus on the political establishment and in the UK and voters being somehow divided, distant from each other, can be seen both in The Guardian and the Mail, although arguably from opposite perspectives. Incidentally, the Mail Online is also the only news outlet the morning after that refers already to Leavers and Remainers as emerging political identities. So what we also can see, so a lot of talk about divisions within and between the UK establishment and the voters, but what we find, much to our surprise actually, is that on the morning of the 24th of June 2016, the EU had already taken a backseat. There wasn't much. There was something on the EU and Brussels authorities and what have you, but far eclipsed by the relation between voters and the political establishment. So a very clear shift in the discourse on the very next morning. Finally, then, the voices of the people, the citizens who are so often invoked. Again, two highlights. One study on Vox Pop, so short interviews with people in the street, and citizens' reactions on Twitter. This is a study that, again, a colleague and I did for the book on Vox Pop, so people being approached by journalists. I've called this the man on the street, woman in brackets, because we only looked at people who declared an intention to vote Leave, and almost in videos. So we have a variety of videos from across the UK and different parts of the constituent nations. Of the intended Leave voters, almost 3/4 were men. Now, we don't know yet if that means that men vote more for Brexit or had the intention, or that women are perhaps more reluctant to speak in public or talk to strangers when approached in the street. So that we don't know that. We haven't checked that yet. Good. But in terms of topics, what we can see in the Vox Pops, what people who say, I will vote Leave, say is important for them, what motivates their decision, right up there is sovereignty. Yeah? Almost twice as important as immigration, interestingly enough. Yeah. So for sovereignty, you find things like, what is the point of we electing our own MPs and our own leaders to make rules and laws for us while everything is being done in Brussels? What's the point? Then immigration, which is tied with the economy as a motivation to vote Leave. We have somebody referring to his own personal experience. He says, I was homeless from November to February. I was told that we couldn't get any help from the council because the migrants come in and Brighton and Eastbourne are housing 1,000 of them. So linking this to his own lived experience here. And then we also have voting motivation for money being paid to the EU. This is a farmer from Wales who said, at the moment, we are paying £6 billion as a UK government into the cap in Brussels. We are only getting 3.8 million back. What the hell is happening with the other 2.2 billion? It's not fair on us at all, is it? So a particular understanding of what counts as fair here. So what we can see, it's also border control, EU being deficient, but to a lesser extent. What we can see here is that the topics of the Leave campaign are echoed, including the economic arguments, so they filter through to the electorate. Leaving the EU is, of course, positive. It's seen as a good option, but it's positive for various reasons. So it could be positive. Remember that politicians and the Leave campaign very much presented the EU as powerful, disempowering the British people and the UK government. So leaving the EU is positive because it gives us more capacity. We can do more. Like, we could employ more people in places like this. This is somebody from Cornwall. Or if we're out from European Union, then people can check if the right person is coming back or not. So border control. And arguably, those are also benefits to Britain, as understood by the voters here. And another reason why leaving the EU is good is because it is the proper thing to do. It's almost the moral thing to do. So somebody says, we need to pay more attention to our own country and not donating so much money to other countries. So what we see here is more evidence of the EU as disempowering, oppressive, and we have other examples where the EU is seen as facilitating the threat of immigration as well. In general, in these Vox Pops, people very much rally around some sort of collective identity as disadvantaged British citizens, as a helpless Britain, the same arguments that I've presented before. So EU membership and the EU itself is seen as very disempowering, which of course means that leave is empowering. But also the referendum itself is already empowering. To be given a say is already empowering in itself. The last study I want to briefly present is one from the book again. So this is of people, this is the months after the referendum and what happened on Twitter under the Brexit hashtag Brexit. Now, you can imagine that this hashtag got very, very prominent very, very quickly. So again, of course, the researchers needed to filter down the data. So only data in English, only private individuals. And interestingly, they also, this was done by a linguist and a computer scientist together. The computer scientist also developed a program for detecting so-called bots or computer-generated tweets, which don't come from actual people. And they didn't want that. They only wanted actual people and individuals. It's interesting, they were very strict about that. They said, if the program tells us that there's only a 50% chance that this tweet was computer-generated, we check it out. So that's very strict, but it still meant they had to check out 80% of tweets. Yeah. Some of them may have been by actual people, but many of them will not have been. So, and there I was thinking naively that Twitter is just a forum for people to express their opinion, right? Yeah, I know, I said naively. Also, Twitter, of course, is not representative in terms of social demographics, yeah? So we have enough studies by now to know that the average Twitter user, the typical Twitter user, is younger than average, not exclusively, but in tendency, that they usually are motivated by negative emotions, and especially when tweets are about political debate, that they tend to be male more often than not. So here's what people did when they used the Brexit hashtag. First of all, the most important thing they want to do is express themselves, their own reaction to the referendum. Remember, this is the month after the referendum. The second one was they wanted to share information of some sort or another relating to the referendum result. And the third thing was that they engaged in playful tweeting behavior, such as in this tweet. What we can also see is their point of view on when they talk about Brexit and the referendum. So is it undetermined, neutral, positive, or negative? When they share information, it is undetermined, followed by negative. But for all other three, it is actually overwhelmingly negative. And that ties in with other studies of Twitter, that events, even seemingly uncontroversial ones, tend to generate an increase in negative sentiment in tweets. So, bluntly speaking, Twitter is where people go if they are unhappy and want to say something negative about something. So, one thing they do that is showing us their emotional reaction to the Brexit referendum. Most obviously, of course, they do that through emotion words. So they say, this is so sad, hashtag Brexit, or never felt prouder than this, we did it, hashtag Brexit. They may do it less obviously to general statements. Sometimes you just have to laugh or you'll cry, hashtag Brexit, hashtag EUREF. Or they may sort of shift the emotion away from themselves to somebody else. So here, an historical figure, so saying, the Iron Lady is smiling down tonight, hashtag Brexit, with a picture of Margaret Thatcher. Or they may be sarcastic to say, oh, not to worry, a huge rise in the market for Union Jack emblazoned stuff will save us, hashtag Brexit. Some seek to engage in arguments here. So one might say, maybe there is hope. That's an emotion, right? Individuals are learning that decentralization is conducive to a more free society. Hashtag Brexit, hashtag EU. Or some of them just simply link it to their personal life, their emotions. So they think, okay, I think, guys, we need all a bit of cheering up, so here's some kitten pictures. I would have liked to include that kitten picture, come to think of it. Okay, so what this means, actually, is that the result of the referendum, so a vote for the Leave campaign, means that the positive and especially the negative emotions of the campaign are actually amplified and reinforced on Twitter, which has happened so often. Good. To conclude then. So, lots of findings. So, what are the main points here? So, I think we can safely say from all this research that both Leave and Remain campaigners represented the EU as deficient or at least problematic. Remember, the EU is bad, but on the Remain side, we should stay in. Leave campaigners also talked about this as disempowering. Remember the passive voice, we are told by Brussels that. Remain politicians and campaigners largely failed to present the EU in positive terms and to make a positive case for EU membership. Remain supporting media echoed the campaign's thematic focus on business and also, to some extent, the negative emotions, as we saw with the case study of The Guardian. The Leave campaign itself was more focused, certainly more engaging linguistically. Yeah, this vote Leave, take control, do something. And Leave arguments and motions were very much echoed by Leave voters, so it did filter through, really. We saw that especially negative campaign emotions were amplified and reinforced on Twitter. And we also saw that immediately after the referendum, we had a discourse shift from EU-UK relations to divisions within and among the UK electorate and establishment, the Leavers and the Remainers. The last slide will be very short, that's the outlook. So we see this discursive shift from EU-UK relations to divisions within and among electorate and political establishment in the UK. At the moment, the discourse seems to mostly center around procedural issues of how to leave. So this discourse is quite divided, to use that metaphor. It's also fairly entrenched. I put a question mark to, can we from this point shift the discourse to a positive view of the EU? Is being anti-Brexit the same as being pro-EU? And is being pro-Brexit, well, maybe it's the same as being anti-EU, but is it the same as being anti-Europe? Or maybe these questions are all completely superfluous and we just go to crisis management. Maybe that will be the shift of the discourse. One way or another, Britain's parameters, economically, geopolitically, etc., are very likely to change one way or another, which may, in the long run, perhaps mean a new discourse on an emerging or adjusted national identity. Given this entrenchment and the metaphorical division, etc., I would like to finish with a plea about how to engage in Brexit discourse. And we can actually start with that straight away. Thank you.